So thank you very much for that very warm welcome. It's lovely to be back here. As I say, this place, this room particularly holds many memories for me. I mean, I was involved when we were first moving here and laying down these floorboards and painting the walls for the first time, so it has many happy memories for me. And it's also really nice to see so many people in the shrine room and a real sort of sense of sort of buzz about the centre. So it's really, really good. So yeah, I'm going to be talking today about the spiritual quality and the spiritual practice of dana, or generosity. And hopefully I'm going to be saying a bit about where dana fits into the Buddhist spiritual path, why dana is important as a spiritual practice, as part of the path of transformation that we have in Buddhism. And also give a few pointers as to how we can make generosity into a practice, in a sense. So we can actually work with our own tendencies around giving over time so that hopefully we transform ourselves into a more naturally generous person. And Kusla said I was very well qualified to talk about generosity, and I have to say, I don't think I am. And one of the things I'm going to say later in this talk is that generosity does not come naturally to me. I would say I'm somebody who's got a lot of anxiety around money, a lot of anxiety around security. So I actually personally find the practice of giving extremely difficult. And I sort of take it on as a kind of advanced spiritual practice. I don't think it's an easy practice at all. And I'm not here to, in a sense, lecture you all about how you should all be a lot more generous than you already are, because I know, my own life it's a difficult thing to develop. But hopefully I can give you some pointers that might be helpful. So I thought we'd start with a short reflection. So if you just close your eyes and take your attention inwards for a moment and just connect to your body and your contact with the ground and an overall sense of how you're feeling. And I wanted you to just call to mind a time in the past. It could be quite recent, it could be longer ago, but a time when you've acted generously, where you've done something to help somebody else. It could be giving them something that they needed, or it could be helping them out in some way. And just notice the emotional atmosphere that goes with that memory. Perhaps recalling what it's like to do something for someone else. And just connect with that. And if there's a sense of positivity, a sense of satisfaction, a sense of well-being that comes with that memory, then just really sort of open to that. Really allow yourself to feel that sense of, anyway, that glow of satisfaction. Allow yourself to feel that and open to it as fully as you can. The Buddha encourages us, when we've done something positive, to allow a space for us to really rejoice in that. Really rejoice in the fact that we've done good. We've made a positive contribution. And really allow ourselves to enjoy that, revel in it. And then when we're ready, we'll bring this short reflection to an end. So just coming back into the room, back into this present moment. And opening your eyes. So hopefully there we had some sense of, what we talk about in Buddhism as positive karma, that when we act in a positive, in a skillful way, as the Buddha says, happiness follows as our shadow follows us. So in a way, whenever we do something positive, whenever we act in a generous way, then that naturally leads to an increase in our own happiness and well-being. And really that's a kind of crucial part of why the practice of generosity is so important on the spiritual path. I thought before I go on, I thought just mention this beautiful rupa on the shrine. It really is exquisite, and it's a rupa of the Buddha figure Ratnasambhava, who's the Buddha associated with generosity. You'll see the Buddha has, one hand in his lap and the other hand with a palm open, this sort of gesture of open generosity. And Ratnasambhava is associated with the colour yellow gold. It's said to be the colour of sunlight on ripened grain. We've actually got a shrine cloth, this beautiful golden colour. And I guess the figure of Ratnasambhava evokes the spiritual quality, the quality of transcendental generosity, which is a sort of completely spontaneous outpouring of warmth and love and generosity and never-ending abundance. And so I think this figure of Ratnasambhava again gives a few hints as to what we're trying to do when we cultivate and we practice generosity. Just get my notes back. Here we are. So as Kusala mentioned, I've worked for the Karuna Trust for many, many years. We have an office upstairs. What we do is we raise money. We have volunteers who go out and knock on people's doors, ask them to sign up for regular standing orders, and then we use that money to fund projects with marginalised communities. And we now work actually in India, Nepal and Bangladesh. And over that 25 years, I've really had the privilege to travel a lot in the countries where we work and meet and spend a lot of time with both the people who are implementing the projects and some of the communities that are sort of benefiting from the project. So in a way, my own spiritual path has been very sort of bound up with this particular project, with the essence of which is, trying to help some of the poorest, some of the most disadvantaged people in the world. And of course, that brings me in touch with, a lot of really inspiring examples of generosity. People who, are very generous in terms of supporting the trust financially and with time and with energy and in other ways. And then in India, some really amazing people who are sort of dedicating their lives, if you like, to, opposing social injustices, to, trying to give a voice to the most marginalised people, to try and help people improve their lives in various different ways. So I think at the moment we're working with something like 130,000 people in India, in Nepal and Bangladesh. And we've got programs focusing on education, livelihoods and women's empowerment, because of course in these traditional societies very often women are subject to a lot of violence and oppression. So in a way that's what we do, and I guess you could say our project is, a living example of the sort of power and effectiveness of generosity and, the beauty of generosity, the fact that generosity can have a profoundly transformative effect on people's lives. I remember somebody saying that the Buddhist practice of dana ennobles both the giver and the receiver. So both the person who gives and the person who receives are ennobled spiritually through the practice of generosity. So as I say, I'm going to talk about the Buddhist practice of generosity, hopefully to say a bit about why generosity is important and to give a few sort of pointers about making generosity into a practice. So I thought we could start with basic Buddhism, the Buddha's Four Noble Truths, the teaching that the Buddha gave immediately after his enlightenment, where he said that the cause of suffering is what you could call selfish craving and attachment. So in a way, the reason why living beings suffer, well, in a way, it's got two parts to it. It's, the first part is that we believe that we have a self which is separate and distinct and fixed and different to the rest of the universe. And the other side of that is the emotionality which arises from that belief, which is the fact that we're, most of the time in our unenlightened state, we're hardwired, you could say, for loss and gain. So when we get something, we feel happy. When we lose something, we feel distressed, dejected. And we can just check this out in our own experience. If we suddenly receive a whole bunch of money that we weren't expecting, we feel delight, don't we? And, if we get a big bill suddenly through the post that we weren't expecting, that means that, we've got less to live on for the next month. Most of us will feel, sad, dejected, unhappy, anxious. So, in a way, in our day-to-day lives, you could say we're sort of hardwired to interpret everything that happens in terms of what I sometimes call the drama of me getting what I want. So, in a way, we have a really strong tendency to interpret what's going on around us with, us either getting what we want or not getting what we want. And it can be almost sort of comical sometimes. I don't know whether anybody else here has got the misfortune of following football. Basically, I support a football team, and I've got this thing set up that when my team is playing, it sends me a text, either when my team scores a goal or when the other team scores a goal. And I'm totally like a kind of clockwork toy about this. My team scores, I can go, oh, great, we're winning. And then, I get another text a few minutes later, the other team has scored 2 goals, and now we're losing. And I can just really feel my emotional state actually just shifting, over something that, really as a grown-up I should understand is not very important. So anyway, you get the point, don't you, that we have a very, very strong tendency to become very narrowly focused on the drama of whether we're going to get what we want or not. And that itself is an underlying cause of suffering. So even when things go our way, even when our team wins, even when we get an unexpected amount of money through the post, there's still this background sense of tension, isn't there? We still experience ourselves, and there's a lovely line in Romeo and Juliet where Romeo says, "Oh, I am fortune's fool." And that puts it very well. To the extent that we're governed by craving and aversion, we're fortune's fool. The ups and downs of life make a fool of us over and over again. We go up when we get what we want, we go down when we don't get what we want. And of course, it's just not possible to always get what we want. It's not possible to never get what we don't want. So to that extent, we're always somehow on shaky ground, aren't we? We're always in an unstable situation. And the Buddhist teacher Shantideva says something kind of earth-shattering about this. He says, all suffering comes from wanting happiness for ourselves. All happiness comes from wanting the happiness of others. So all suffering comes from wanting happiness for ourselves. And all happiness comes from wanting the happiness of others. So I guess what he's pointing to is that the Buddhist path is about learning to live in a way that's less focused, less narrowly focused on our own needs and desires. And it's much more broadly focused on the needs of others and the needs of the overall situation. So as we practice Buddhism, we're trying to, in a way, become less fortune's fool, to become less affected by the ups and downs of things as they affect our own well-being, and more focused over time on trying to see what's right for other people and for the broader situation. And really, in a way, you could say that's the whole of the spiritual path, right there. And obviously within this we can see why the practice of giving, the practice of dana, is an important spiritual practice. In a way it's the central aspect of the path that leads to the end of suffering, because it's always to some degree reversing that sort of deep, hardwired tendency to focus in an anxious way on our own desires and needs. And there's another great quote from Shelley, which if you studied Sangharakshita's book, The 10 Pillars of Buddhism, he quotes in this book, but it's a lovely quote. So Shelley says, "The great secret of morals is love, or a going out of our nature and an identification of ourselves with the beautiful which exists in the thought, action, or person not our own. To be greatly good, we must imagine intensely and comprehensively. We must put ourselves in the place of others, of many others, so the pains and pleasures of our species must become our own." So what Shelley's saying is, in a way, we have to, open the focus of our attention very, very wide indeed. We have to go from just thinking about ourselves and what we need and what's right for us, to thinking about the whole species, the whole of humankind. And from a Buddhist point of view, of course, with the practice of metta bhavana, we're going even further than that. We're trying to develop some kind of focus on the happiness and well-being of all living beings. So we're trying to sort of broaden it out as far as our imagination can possibly take us. And you could say that this sort of broadening of our perspective to include the needs of others, it sort of breaks the spell of our isolated self-involvement. Hopefully, when we were connecting with that reflection at the beginning, we had a felt sense that the practice of generosity brings a sense of lightness and spaciousness around whatever we're experiencing. So if we're feeling upset or down or sad, if we can just get ourselves to the point of doing something for somebody else, that will automatically open a sense of space around whatever we're experiencing, and will make our experience of dukkha, of suffering in that moment, easier to bear. So, if we're feeling unhappy, if we just focus on the happiness and well-being of others, then that will help us. And just a very, very simple hack actually is do the second stage of the metta bhavana. If you're feeling a bit down, you're feeling a bit unhappy, just spend 5 minutes thinking about a friend and wishing your friend well, and then just notice if that brings about a kind of lifting and broadening of your mental state. And Sangharakshita was very supportive of our Karana fundraising appeals. So we run these appeals where we get volunteers, and they go out and they knock on people's doors and they tell people about the work, and they do the fundraising. And I think it's very hard work. Well, I've done it. It is very hard work and quite challenging. But Sangharakshita certainly saw it as being a very effective, transformative spiritual practice, because in a way, through doing an appeal, you're really putting yourself in a situation where you're having to do something really intensively to help other people. And there's something about that that's very, very transformative. And a lot of the people over the years who've done our Karana appeals will say, of all the things that I've done, this is one of the practices that's, really helped me, that's really brought about a shift or a change in my practice and in my mental states. So, just to give you a bit of sort of traditional Buddhist teaching, in traditional Buddhism, giving is said to be of different types. So we can give material things, money and possessions. We can give our time, our energy, our attention. There's one that's the giving of fearlessness. So, if we just try and help people become more confident, that's a form of giving. And then finally, there's giving the gift of the Dharma. So, in a way, sharing the teachings with others in an appropriate and helpful way is a form of giving. So those are the sort of traditional forms of giving. And I was thinking, if we think about our own era, I think we have access to a sort of wealth of global information which people in India didn't have at the time. And maybe we can think of adding something, for example, we can think about environmental dharma, environmental generosity. So, through our work in Karana, we're very aware that people in developing countries, people in India, Nepal, Bangladesh, are very often at the forefront of problems that are caused by global warming. So, people in remote villages in India are experiencing flooding and drought and disruption to their livelihoods, disruption to their traditional agricultural farming methods and so on. And actually, they're not the people who've really created the problem, are they? I mean, they're not the people who've created the carbon emissions that are driving global warming. In a way, those problems are created in the developed world. So you've got a situation where there's quite an injustice going on around, who's creating global warming versus, who's at the sharp end of having to deal with the consequences of it. So I think there's a case for saying that we need to think about practicing a kind of global environmental generosity, where we're thinking about what we do in relation to its effect on people in other parts of the world, particularly in the developing world, and also in relation to future generations. As a generation, we're probably using up a lot more than our share of the resources and leaving problems for future generations. So it's another form of generosity that perhaps we can think about. So in a way, how do we practice? I mean, you're probably thinking, oh, this all sounds very good. Yes, I get it. Yeah, generosity is a very good thing. But yeah, it's hard. I think practicing generosity is really hard. I mean, very often in presentations of the Dharma, the practice of generosity, of giving, is presented as being the kind of basic sort of starter practice. You start off trying to be generous, and then you kind of go off after that and you develop insight and become enlightened. But I mean, I would say that certainly for me, the practice of generosity is a really difficult practice. It's really difficult to be generous. I don't think I'm a very naturally generous person. I think I've got a lot of anxiety about money and material security. And I guess in a way it's not surprising that it's a difficult practice because, we are trying to undo, a lot of conditioning. I think maybe even evolutionary, we're hardwired to think in terms of our own self-preservation and to kind of prioritise our own needs and our own survival over everything else. So I think we're trying to undo some very, very deeply entrenched conditioning by trying to become more generous. So I think we're deeply conditioned to think that our own needs are more important than the needs of others. And we have to kind of work against that in order to become more generous. And I think in day-to-day practice, I think a lot of the time we've got mixed motives for giving. So if we're honest with ourselves, if we're being asked to give something, we do genuinely, part of us does genuinely want the other person to be happy. But then we may also look at our own motivations and realise that, well, there is some sort of subtle degree of self-reference. When we're giving, there's part of us that's kind of wanting something back in return. Even if it's just to be thanked or to be appreciated or for people to think that we're a good person. I think, you see this, just to say that. So in Buddhism, they're said to be almost like kind of different levels to the practice of generosity. So, at first, we do find that we're practicing with mixed motives. But then if you come to, like, the figure of Ratnasambhava, if you come to this quality of enlightened generosity, then the idea is that for an enlightened being, in a way, giving is just a completely natural, completely spontaneous activity. And it's said with no sense of there being anything given, there being no sense of there being a really existing giver or receiver, just this kind of natural, spontaneous flow of generosity, of giving, of natural spiritual energy. So the Buddha or the Bodhisattva is said to be completely spontaneously ethical, completely spontaneously generous. It would never occur to an enlightened being not to be generous or have any reason not to give. And that, in a way, that's the kind of ideal, that we're trying to get to a point where giving, being generous, is something that's completely natural, completely spontaneous, completely sort of free-flowing. But, if we look at our own experience, we're not there yet. We're not yet able to give in that sort of completely pure, completely spontaneous way. In a way, there's, for us, there's still a kind of dialogue, an internal dialogue that goes on around giving. So I've just got a few sort of tips around how we can make generosity into a practice, how we can try to become more generous over time, so that our generosity becomes, over time, less self-interested, less referential, and more, sort of closer and closer to this kind of enlightened ideal of completely spontaneous generosity. So my first suggestion is, in a way, goes back to the reflection that we did at the start of this. It's just notice and reflect on how being generous makes us feel good, and how being mean and self-focused leads to us feeling isolated and unhappy. So in a way, just reflect on that and just maybe experiment with it in your own experience. Try giving, being a bit more helpful, volunteering to do things, and then just see, does that lead to greater generosity, greater happiness and well-being? And just notice when we're not able to be generous as well, and notice how there's a kind of sense of dissatisfaction, or there's a level of unhappiness that we experience when we refuse to, when there's an opportunity to give and we sort of turn it down, how there's a kind of subtle sense of sort of self-disappointment when we do that. So that's, in a way, notice what it's like to give. And then also, secondly, to notice what happens in our direct experience when we're asked to give. So when an opportunity to give comes up, just notice what happens in our experience. So very often we'll find that we've got an initial emotional impulse to give, in a way, very, very often spontaneously. If somebody asks us to give and they're asking us, for a good reason, and we can really relate to that, there's part of us, we have a heart response of wanting to sort of say yes, wanting to respond. We have a kind of instinct, I think, to want to respond to the needs of others. But then very often what will happen is another level of thinking will come in. After the initial emotional yes, our kind of minds, our thinking minds will come in and go, ooh, and come up with all the reasons why it's not a good idea for us to give. So, if somebody asks us for money, perhaps we'll think, we'll think of all the reasons why money's tight for us at the moment. Or if somebody asks us to volunteer for something, we'll think about reasons why we're too busy to do it, or whatever. So very often that sort of second layer of thinking comes up and it kind of stifles that initial generous impulse, and we decide, we're not going to give. And this is an experience that comes up a lot in India, because, I guess, can I just see, how many people here have been to India? Just a show of hands. Okay. Yeah. So I guess when you've been to India, if you're going around the Indian cities, you'll see people, inevitably, you'll see people begging, you'll see people asking for money. And one of the things that, if you've ever driven in a car or a taxi through one of the big Indian cities, it nearly always happens, you'll pull up at a traffic junction, the light will be red, and the car will stop, and then there'll be a knock on the window, and you'll kind of look out of the window and you'll see usually, sometimes a very, very young child, or a mother and a very young baby just standing, in the narrow gap between the cars, at the road junction, and they'll point to their mouths and be asking you to give money. And this is a very, very shocking experience for many of us, from the West. So very often the young child will be dressed in kind of very dirty clothes, and their hair will be very matted, you know, their face will be very sort of very dirty, and you know, and it's quite a sort of complex situation because you don't really know what the situation is. So, you know, you hear stories that these children are sent out by, that there's kind of gangs who are kind of controlling the situation, and that the children will be giving the money to. So you're left with this very sort of ambiguous situation in a way. You've got this kind of very emotional response, you know, wanting to respond to the need of this human being who's just the other side of this window. And then the other side, you're aware of a very kind of complex situation, and it's quite possible that by giving money to that child, you know, you may be actually perpetuating the situation that means that the child is there in that very dangerous situation. So it's actually quite a it's quite a conundrum, and I guess there probably isn't really a right answer to it. But I'd suggest that, you know, generally, the practice of becoming more generous is learning to go with the initial generous impulse. So in a way, there's part of us that wants to be generous, that knows how to be generous, that has a kind of longing for a sense of connection with other human beings, with other living beings. And I think part of the practice of generosity is kind of giving that instinct the benefit of the doubt. So even if we don't know whether giving money to somebody is going to help or not, you know, even knowing that actually giving money might harm, if we're trying to practice generosity, it's probably still better to give in that situation, just to listen to that generous impulse. So if we have a generous impulse, just to try and act on that, even if it's only in a very small way. Because under the principle of karma, the impulses we go with, the impulses that we act on, grow stronger. So deciding to act generously, we're increasing that tendency in ourselves so that we're more likely to be able to respond generously in the future. And the way that it works is that, you know, an action becomes a predisposition, becomes a tendency, and gradually becomes a kind of character trait. So if we can really train ourselves in responding generously every time that generous impulse comes up, and every time, in a way, backing that generous impulse rather than the reasons why we shouldn't give, by doing that, we'll, in a way, gradually sort of recondition ourselves, recondition our responses, so that eventually we become a naturally generous person. Does that mean? So, in a way, we reach a point where it no longer becomes a question whether we give or not. You know, we'll always respond generously in that situation. I think they say in neuroscience, don't they? They've shown that an impulse creates a kind of connection in the brain. The brain actually wires itself around what we have impulses to do, and if we act on an impulse, that strengthens that wiring. So you could say in terms of karma, the actions that we do, they actually sort of rewire our neurology so that gradually these positive tendencies become more and more our kind of default responses in situations. And that's kind of how we transform ourselves over time. In a way, that's the way that the Buddhist spiritual path works. We go from being narrowly self-referential beings into being, you know, naturally expansive, naturally generous. We become like the Sambhava more and more over time. And then another little tip, how can we make generosity into a spiritual path, is to really notice and rejoice in the generosity of others. You know, one of the things I've said is that, you know, in my work at Karana, I come across some really, really amazing people who, you know, very often in India actually, people are putting their own safety on the line in order to respond to the needs of poor communities. People are taking tremendous risks and making tremendous sacrifices, you know, out of this desire to help people, to respond to the needs of the poorest people. And just recently, just to give you an example, recently there was somebody who'd been giving a small amount of money actually to Karanar for about 15, 20 years. And they suddenly got in touch and said they wanted to make a major donation to our work. And it turned out they actually gave £100,000 to Karanar's work. And, you know, one of our fundraisers spoke to this person about this and said, well, you know, what was it that led you to do this? And he said, well, he's got all this money. He said he's got more money than he thinks he needs. He's in his sort of late middle age. He's approaching being old. He said he didn't want to wait until he died to leave his money in his will. He wanted to give the money before he died so that he could do some good, make some change in the world during his lifetime. And he said that he'd read some of the stuff that we'd sent to him as a Karanar supporter, and he'd found out about girls in India and the fact that girls very often don't get the chance to get an education. So girls from poor backgrounds are often taken out of school at the age of sort of 10 or 11. When they start to reach their puberty, very often families from very poor backgrounds will take their girls out of school. So they lose out on the opportunity of education. And then they either get forced into early marriage, which can often be very, very disastrous, or they're made to work, you know, made to do agricultural or domestic work or whatever. So he'd read this, and he basically really, you know, he has his own daughters who he loves, and he really wanted to help, you know, girls in India to stay in school and get an education so that they could, you know, have the most possible life opportunities. I just think, you know, in a way that's kind of amazing, isn't it? You know, I heard about this at a time when, you know, obviously the invasion of Ukraine was going on. I was just looking at the world and thinking, God, you know, the world is a pretty dreadful place, and human beings are capable of some pretty dreadful things. Then all of a sudden, I just heard this story of just incredible imagination and generosity, and, you know, just really, well, it made me think that yes, human beings are capable of enormous damage and enormous wickedness, but also human beings have got this incredible capacity for doing good, you know, for trying to have a positive impact on the world. And, you know, he could have spent that £100,000 on, I don't know, a sports car or a yacht, or I don't know what you could buy for £100,000, but anyway, he chose not to do that, but to give this money instead to helping, you know, girls the other side of the world who he's never met, you know, have more opportunities in life. So anyway, we can see that dana is a really sort of crucial part of the spiritual path. In a way, what we're trying to do is develop a more generous attitude, a more generous way of thinking, so that over time generosity becomes our kind of default response to whatever happens. I would say that dana is not a kind of basic Buddhist practice. It's not a sort of beginner's Buddhist practice. In a way, it's there all the way through the spiritual path, all the way through the spiritual path. There's opportunities to become less self-referential, to become more other-regarding, to become more generous. And as I say, dana is a difficult practice. It doesn't necessarily come naturally to us. I think actually some people are naturally more generous than others. And I'm saying this as somebody who's naturally not particularly generous. But I think, you know, all of us have different conditioning. I think some people find it very easy to give, and other people find it much more difficult. So I think in a way we shouldn't judge ourselves or compare ourselves with others in terms of our practice of generosity. But what we can do is try and become more generous over time. If we compare ourselves to our past self, you know, hopefully we can see some movement and some progress. So we're trying to develop a more generous attitude that can eventually become a generous embedded character trait, part of the way that we are in the world. And I wanted to finish by just mentioning another really powerful mental state and a really powerful practice, which is to say, I think it's really important to cultivate a sense of gratitude for what we've been given. So in a way, I think gratitude is in a way the other side of the coin to the practice of dana. I think it can be a really powerful thing to just reflect on how much we've been given, and you know, when we've been given something, really to sort of open to a sense of gratitude for that. And this is something that, you know, I often think about in terms of, you know, when I've been to India, I've been sort of seeing the situation for a lot of people in India, and I come back to, you know, my own life in the UK. You know, I'm very often just really, really struck by the sense to which, you know, in relation to so many people in the world, actually we're so privileged in terms of what we have and the opportunities that we have. And, you know, I know that, you know, in the West we have our own particular forms of suffering. I know that, and I know that, you know, many people in the West do suffer, you know, in genuine and terrible ways. But certainly materially, and if we can think about, you know, take for example the kids that are begging in the streets in Mumbai, or people living in the slums in Mumbai, or people living in all kinds of different situations in many, many parts of the world. If those people were able to somehow be teleported into our lives and would suddenly, you know, wake up one morning and find themselves, you know, living in our houses, you know, with our kitchens and our fridges and our food and our bank balances, they think they would be in heaven, wouldn't they? You know, so many people in the world, if they were to change places with us, they just would not be able to believe how, you know, how much good stuff we've got going on in our lives. And I think it's just a really, without, you know, wanting to be, you know, wanting to sort of put ourselves into any kind of guilt trip, just to kind of think, just to reflect on, well, you know, compared to so many other people in so many different parts of the world now, and also, you know, human beings throughout history. You know, if you think about human beings throughout the evolution of human beings, we're on a kind of real summit in terms of the things that we have in our lives, the kind of level of comfort, the level of facilities, and the level of opportunities that we have to make choices, to do different things with our lives. So I think we can really try and come to a point of really kind of appreciating that. And I think that practicing gratitude and appreciation for what we have, actually, it kind of is an important condition for practicing generosity. So, you know, if we think about the figure of Ratnasambhava, it's this sense of abundance. It's this sense of, you know, we've got so much, we've got so much. We've got things to spare. We've got things that we can give. We've got energy to spare. We've got time to spare. Perhaps for some of us, a small amount of money to spare, but we do have it to spare. We have it to give. So cultivating that sense of kind of inner abundance, you know, that we are lucky, we are fortunate, we do have, in many cases, more than we need. In a way, that can be a really good reflection to help us, you know, come from a place of inner poverty to a place of inner abundance, and from there, you know, wanting to share and to give what we have.